Hello and welcome to our second part of our three-part DevSecOps webinar series. First one, we talked about what is DevSecOps. Today, it's going to be why adopt DevSecOps. And then our third piece will be how do you adopt DevSecOps. So if you haven't already listened to part one, again, which is the what is DevSecOps, it is available on our YouTube channel. It's also available on our website. And also, if you aren't already following us on LinkedIn or Twitter, go ahead and follow us so you can attend part 3 of the series, along with staying up to date on any of the information that we continuously publish, not only around DevSecOps, but also around cloud. We have a lot of great material that's coming. So I'll be with you today. My name is Josh Minthorn. I'm a director here at Excelino. And my background is been in IT consulting, and I started on the development side. And throughout my career, I was exposed to the infrastructure side of things, along with security. And two things that I really saw, through my career is that, um, you know, number of challenges in the SDLC. One really being security, waiting until the end, and then the other one was around automation. Obviously, that's a big piece when we think about DevOps, and especially now with DevSecOps and security, we think of automation and other things. But it's really about going to that next level, and not just thinking of security in a silo. And that's part of what we're going to continue to talk about here with why adopting DevSecOps. And again, part 3 will be how do you go about adopting DevSecOps. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, we're going to really talk about why adopt DevSecOps. And so what I want to do is first look at some trends. Now, some of this information comes from IBM. They did an analysis of some data compiled by the Ponemon Institute, and really want to look through those. Now, before we get to that, the question is what is DevSecOps? And really this comes from Shannon Leitz, co-author of the DevSecOps Manifesto. And I want to cover this because we really want to keep this in our minds when we're thinking about DevSecOps. As you can see here, the purpose and the intent of DevSecOps is to build on the mindset that everyone is responsible for security, with the goal of safely distributing security decisions at speed and scale to those who hold the highest level of context without sacrificing the safety required. So really and truly, what does that mean? Everybody should be thinking about security. We've got to think about distributing security decisions. That's about enabling and not having just one team focused on security, and to be able to do it at speed and at scale. And that's where that distributed piece comes from. And really, again, what this is about is making sure that we fold in security across the board. We talked about that in part 1. We're going to go into it more here today, and then we're going to see much more about the how in part 3. So what is DevSecOps? What should the SDLC look like? Well, 1, we need to shift security left. 2, integrate seamlessly for development. We're going to put Dev, Sec, and Ops all on the same page at the same time. We're going to make sure that as part of this, any compliance and auditing is done sooner. And we talk a lot about automate, automate, automate. Now, we talk a lot about automation. That gets a lot of the attention. However, that is not the only piece. Just because you increase the amount of automation does not mean that you have DevSecOps. Automation is a part of it, is a key component, but there's other pieces to it as well. So, again, thinking through some of these trends that were found. Right? So we're thinking about what do we want with DevSecOps? What's the point? And what you see here is what's the cost. And in a way, it's almost as though we say, what's the cost of maybe not doing DevSecOps? Or what could DevSecOps save us? Now, obviously, it's going to be different for every company. It's going to be different for every company within an industry. It's going to be different for different industries. And this data actually comes across for a lot of different companies of different sizes across different industries. And there's some trends here that we see. And what's important here is there's a couple of things. One is some of the trends we see has to do with a little bit of what's happened with the pandemic and more remote work. However, I think that just accelerated what some companies may have already been doing or planned on doing. And then also we see things around the cloud and things like that, which more and more companies are moving into. So when we look at these key metrics, if we take a look here at the first one, we see 10%. So the question is what is that? Well, that's an increase in the average cost of a breach. So the average cost of a breach, increased by nearly 10% year over year, and 2021 was the single year cost increase over the last 7 years. It had the highest increase over any of the other years. And to put that into a numbers perspective, so the cost of a breach rose from roughly $3.86 million to 4.24. Again, that's the highest average total cost in the history of this report. And so now some of these costs were significantly lower for organizations, and the question is what organizations? And those were companies, those were organizations that had a better security posture and really had really put in a lot of additional security, automation, things around zero trust. They were in the cloud, but they had put security things in place, development, operations, everything as part of that, as opposed to allowing the cloud to just kind of be a sandbox. And so that really saw, again, as the cost went up, there were certain organizations where that cost per breach did not increase anywhere near close to 10%, and those were the ones that already had security and automation in place. Now, the next piece is around this 1.7. So $1.7 million was the cost difference where a remote worker was a factor in causing the breach. Now, as we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic, remote working coupled with digital transformation, because companies were already going through that, increased the average total cost of a data breach. Now, it's not something that says, well, remote working and digital transformation are causing this. It's actually just a change of how things are being done, and therefore, when we go, companies are going through these changes and additional things that really need to be looked at. So the average cost of $1.07 million was higher in breaches where remote work was a factor in causing the breach compared to those where remote work was not a factor. So again, that's not saying remote work is the reason for the breach. It is saying when there was a breach and that breach was caused by some sort of remote work, those tended to be higher. Now, if you think about that, okay, well, how many companies where was that a factor? And so remote work was a factor in 17.5% of those companies. So just shy of a fifth of companies that had remote work was the reason for a breach. The other part of this too, which is important to look at, and we'll dive into this a little bit further in one of the other numbers, but organizations that had more than 50% of their workforce working remotely took approximately 60 is actually 58 days longer to identify and contain breaches than those that had 50% or less working. Again, that's not to say that working remote versus not working remote adds time. What it's about is when folks or teams are working remotely, there has to be adjustments in other ways to be able to accommodate that, is to not increase breaches, to not increase the cost of a breach, and also to reduce the amount of time that it takes to mitigate anything. Now, the other part of this too is IT changes. Again, cloud migration, working remote, those increase costs. But the thing is that organizations that did not implement digital transformation changes as a result of COVID, they actually experienced $750,000 higher costs compared to those really compared to the global average. So that's roughly a 16, almost 17% difference. So again, we might think, well, digital transformation, well, maybe we don't do that. But those that weren't doing that had an even higher cost. And again, that comes down to when you're going through digital transformation, you're going through changes. And yes, some of those changes could potentially introduce a breach. However, those changes could also reduce the cost of a breach and reduce the time of a breach. So moving on to the next one, 38% lost business share of total breach costs. Now this one I found the most compelling because this is actually difficult to really measure, to really quantify this because there's quantitative and qualitative things that go with losing business. And the way that this was calculated was, honestly, the lost business really represented the largest share of the cost within a breach. And that's really, really important because, again, we think about what's the cost of other things and what's the cost of the breach. But again, we don't necessarily always think of what's that lost business, yet it usually represents the largest portion of a cost. Now, this number did increase from previous years. And again, when they think about lost business costs, it includes customer turnover, lost revenue due to system downtime, increasing the cost of acquiring new business due to diminished reputation. So it's, again, impacts existing customers. It impacts revenue because maybe, again, those systems can't perform functions that are helping generate revenue, but then also going out and acquiring that new business because there's, the brand reputation and maybe some of the recognition has been tarnished. So the next one is when we think of this $180, and that is per record cost of personally identifiable information. Now, obviously, this depends really and truly on the industry and everything. Some industries, this information is absolutely critical. And even with some industries where this isn't, the thing is that it can still have a pretty big cost associated with it. And this was the most, when we looked at a breach, right? So the personally identifiable information was the most common type of record that was lost, and was actually included in 44% of all breaches. So just shy of half of all breaches had people's information, being stolen. And then again, now 180 is the costliest type of a record that either lost or stolen. Now, where does this compare to previously? Well, in 2021, it was 161, and that's an increase from 2020 of 146 of any type of record. So 20%. 20% is the share of breaches initially caused by compromised credentials. One of the things that we really work with when working with customers is we think of security and everything. What about credentials? How are user credentials being stored, both as customers and internal users? But what about other types of accounts, user accounts, things like that? And not only that, not only how is that being stored, but what access do those accounts have? We think about the information and data. What about that data? How is that being protected? How is that being secured and everything? And what's important here, this was the most common initial attack vector. And again, it was responsible for 20% of all breaches. So you can see roughly a fifth of all breaches caused by compromised credentials. And then of all of those breaches, roughly half, there were personally identifiable information that was stolen. And so it's very, very important when we start to think about what's the initial attack vector and what's the cost and things like that. Now, our last number here is the average number of days to identify and contain a data breach. And this one is really, really important because there's once a breach happens, the clock starts ticking, and for every tick on that clock, there is a cost in a lot of different ways. And so if we can not only help restrict getting in, but also what can be done internally to reduce the amount of time to identify and contain a breach, we're reducing not only our own overall risk, but also the cost. And that's really and truly where DevSecOps starts to come into play, and why It's really, really important. To dive into this number a little bit further, again, the longer it took to identify and contain, the more costly the breach. Data breaches that took longer than 200 days to identify and contain cost on average $4.87 million. Now that's up. And when you compare that to $3.61 million for days that took less than 200. So you can get over, right? You kind of hit that threshold of 200 days, and all of a sudden that cost jumps up roughly $1.2 million. That's a significant cost in terms of a company. It can be very, very detrimental to financial statements and a lot of other things. So again, overall, it took an average of 287 days to identify and contain a breach. That's 7 days longer than previously. And if we think about this, let's put this in context. So if a breach took place on, say, January 1st of this year, the amount of time to identify and contain the breach, it would not be fixed until roughly middle of October. That's a long time. That's roughly 287 days. Now, number of things went into the average time it takes to identify and contain a breach. Things like the attack vector and stuff like that. But the other thing is that what was found is that companies that had things like security, AI, and automation, depending on where they were at, and from a cloud modernization standpoint, things there could absolutely and typically did shrink that number by quite a bit. Again, it varied, and there's a lot of things to take into that. But again, getting those days down really makes a fundamental difference. So if we keep moving forward, so we looked at some of the things of what's the cost, right? What's the cost of not having DevSecOps, or you could say, what are the costs that we want to reduce by implementing DevSecOps? We've got an idea here. Now, the question is, so why? So why does DevSecOps really matter? And the question is really what's the impact? And there's a lot of things that we can put here, but I boiled this down to make this very digestible. It's 4 very simple things. One is we want to focus on security at the beginning. Why? When we focus on security at the beginning, remember we mentioned Dev, Sec, and Ops all together on the same page, same time. When we focus on this together, everybody's thinking about it. Remember that shared responsibility, that distributed responsibility, doing these things at scale. So by, again, focusing on security at the beginning, what do we start to do? And I mentioned this in part 1, and you'll see this in part 3. We want to implement things securely over just implementing security processes. That's not to say you don't need security processes, you do, but if we focus on things at the beginning, everybody can be thinking about how do we implement things securely. We want to increase quality and security with speed. So if we think about that, we want to make sure that the quality of what's being developed and being released and what's being run, that quality goes up. And that is around stability. It also means functionality that end users want and what draws them to use it and how it helps them. Because when things are stable and work and it provides those benefits, people want to use it. And if things can be done sooner, and there's that speed piece, then it's a more valuable platform or system. And we want to make sure that we're also increasing security, because if we don't have security, well, everything might be humming right along, but then all of a sudden, if something has to be taken offline because, for whatever reason, somebody can't use that platform anymore, well, then there's a problem. So again, we want to increase quality and security along with speed. Next, we want to use automation to reduce vulnerabilities and increase coverage. This goes from every single piece, again, at the beginning. What is development doing? What about standing up the infrastructure that applications and things are going to get deployed to? How is that infrastructure provisioned? How is it configured? How is it managed? How is the application configured and deployed and managed? And everything that goes with it. And it's not just getting it out the door. Now that things are running, right? That infrastructure, how is it being scanned and updated and patched? How's the application being scanned and updated and patched, and anything else? And also, what about any other sort of observability and monitoring and things like that? It has to be ongoing at all times. And then we want to encourage to build security into everything. Again, we don't want to look at it as, okay, let's hash the passwords and let's make sure we have a username and these sorts of things. We want to look at it as, are we scanning to make sure software composition analysis? Are we making sure that we're going through a change management process, not to hinder, right? We don't want to hinder, but it's about tracking and auditing and understanding what's deployed and where. Down to the standpoint of in terms of processes, making sure that the deployment process to every environment is really uniform. We want, and this goes to the automation. How do we do that in an automated way, and things like that. Now, what are the benefits? So you see this current state and future state. Here's where we want to get to, right? What are the benefits as we're going towards this future state? And how you get there is going to be a little bit different for everybody. But there's ways that you can kind of measure, and that's what's going to be in part 3. But there's some things that we really and truly want to look at. One is we want to be increasing the speed and rate of delivery. We want to be reducing expense associated with that delivery. We want to make sure we have security, monitoring, and deployment checks from beginning to end throughout the entire SDLC, every environment, everywhere, right? Making sure everybody kind of knows what's going on. We also want to make sure that all of IT, everybody involved in the SDLC, really supports an open and transparent communication that goes from development to operations. The way that when working with customers, we like to say, hey, here's really what the mindset needs to be of everybody. It really needs to be that everybody's working towards the same goal. And I think, all of our customers, they're doing that, but they're maybe just not quite as cognizant of it. So we say everybody's working towards the same goal. The difference is that everybody's doing it from a different angle. And so since everybody's just doing it from a different angle, working towards the same goal, everybody needs to really be talking and facilitating communication and collaboration and making sure that everything continues to work. And if something goes wrong or whatever it is, really it's a learning process. I like to say, they say fail forward. I don't think it's necessarily a failure. It's really about how do we learn and improve, because it doesn't stop. It's consistent, right? Cyber attacks, security, things like that, those things are always changing. There's always different ways. And so the process and everybody working together always has to be really thinking and moving forward and learning from what's currently being done, to say, hey, how can we improve this? Well, the other things is you want to have security by design and the ability to measure. That goes into, for instance, software composition analysis. There's SAST and DAST and IAST, basically different types of scans. There's code coverage. There's vulnerability reports. There's all sorts of metrics and things, that is, really what's running and what's the state at any given time. And so you want to be able to have that, and you want to be able to measure that, because that can show, right, areas of improvement. It can also show over a period of time if there were certain actions that were taken, or shall we say not taken, where potentially there was an increase in, let's say, the number of vulnerabilities or some other things. And so it really, by having the information, by being able to measure, it helps provide a guide of, hey, where can changes be made, or where are vulnerabilities being introduced into the process, things like that. We absolutely are going to want to be working on increasing recovery speed and decreasing our troubleshooting time, as we talked about the time for a breach. And so the other part too is, again, always improving through automation. A lot of different ways to do that, right? CI/CD, immutable infrastructure, etc. Again, that'll be something that we dig into further, more on part 3. Now, what are we talking about here? So this is what we normally see. And I mentioned this in our first series of this. We typically see it during a development cycle, the development team and the QA team, and they're doing their thing. And then what happens is you've got the security team. Now, the thing is we're not going to go into this process, but really what I wanted to highlight here is that when there's a separate security team that's really working outside of the boundaries of kind of the software development lifecycle. And yes, at the bottom I show it that it's all here, but that's just to say, time going forward. It's really easy, which is what this is showing, that security becomes an afterthought, right? The dev and the QA teams have done everything, and now security, right? They're after everything else. And so when we think about this and everything, we don't want to do this anymore. The thing is that by really adopting DevSecOps, it may not necessarily, let's say, boost the bottom line. It can protect the bottom line. As we talked about, it can definitely protect from potential costs being incurred. The other thing is that what we really have seen is that it does, if used properly, and this is what one of the things that we help customers with, is how do you use adopting DevSecOps and how do you make that become a competitive advantage? And really what it comes down to, quite simply, is it makes sure that whether it's now or just even in the future, that the organizations are really able to be positioned as a very reliable and trusted partner compared to the competition. And and it's interesting to think about it like that, but if we think about the role that software plays now with organizations, a lot of companies are really and truly software companies. Obviously, there's companies that have physical goods, but what if you got to make those physical goods, and those physical goods have software and things in them? That's a component of this. And so that's a big thing here is we want to make sure that DevSecOps is or excuse me, that security is not an afterthought. It needs to be up front, as we've talked about, and really then position this to really embody this and make the DevSecOps help you gain a competitive advantage. As you can see here, this goes about into deploying. Now, I put this here, I bring this back up because as we look at our DevOps process and everything, there's a lot of things that we want to do. And so if we look at all of these areas and what this is about is when we think about why DevSecOps is because if you look at this, a lot of times when we think of DevOps, it looks at dev and it looks at ops. And yes, we're thinking of it together, but there's usually a delineation, and everybody again still trying to work together. But when we think of DevSecOps, if you see this doesn't have security at one piece, this has security throughout multiple stages or phases, if you will, of dev and multiple phases of ops as well. It is consistent and happening all the time. And again, this is about doing this at scale. It's about speed. It's about distributing the security responsibility and starting with security first. And so that's the other piece of this, again, is when we think about this, why this is so critically important. And the thing is that really what this means is that you start to move into having improved proactive security. And that's the other piece is with DevSecOps, that's what it is about. We're improving security and we're getting to be proactive security as opposed to that reactive security. And so we're going to be introducing through DevSecOps cybersecurity processes from the very beginning of the development lifecycle, which if you look at this, it's always ongoing, but we're introducing it much earlier. And then how does everything get done in terms of code being reviewed, audited, and scanned and tested for security issues? And then when there are issues that are found, they're discussed and they may be addressed. They may be kind of put on a list that says, hey, these don't need to be addressed, but at least they're now known. And so, again, being able to communicate and say, we've identified these and let's go ahead and address them or not address them. And it's always about understanding what's been fixed, what hasn't been fixed. And if you do need to fix something from a security standpoint, what are some of the other dependencies that may be needed? Maybe there needs to be a discussion, whatever it may be. The thing is that to be able to do that, it's about being proactive and having the right communication. And again, making sure it is done earlier in the cycle. So With DevSecOps, that's one of the reasons why you want to do it. It's about having these security conversations much earlier. The other part too is that what this will lead to is it will lead to continued and better collaboration among now not just the dev and ops teams, but now we're involving security. And so what that does is now an organization is much better to be equipped to really and truly handle incidences. And this helps with everybody being aware of everything and being on the same page. So now when there is something where we need to respond, we can do that. Right? Or shall I say, you all will be able to do that. And that's a key piece of this too, is it's not just about in development, but when there is an incident, being able to respond quickly and making sure that when a fix goes out the door, that other things are not being introduced as well. And I can't tell you how many times I saw that earlier in my career where code would have to be fixed because there was some sort of incident or something was found, a vulnerability, and then through that fix it introduced others. Now that wasn't as high priority, but we still, again, the tech deck was built with all of this because it was known, but yet it wasn't a high priority compared to other things. And at the end of the day, that tech debt really and truly represented risk. Now, again, we get into greater detail about implementing and adopting DevSecOps in part three, but there's a couple of items I want to touch on because it really does, become very important when we think of, the benefits and the why of DevSecOps. Okay, so before I dive into that, though, what is one of the things that we really want to do? We ultimately we're used to a bottleneck being here with security. We want to remove that bottleneck. We want to put everybody same page and we want to shift left. And so how do we do part of this? Well, one, we got to make sure that security is everyone's responsibility. And by doing that, again, why DevSecOps? It will help do that. And by doing that, now you've increased what we like to call is the field of vision. And that's from a security standpoint. It's the field of vision because now you have multiple groups thinking about security. So the field in which security is being looked at is much, much larger through different points in the process. Um, and now it's just not the security team, right? It's more and more teams. And now everybody is really and truly thinking about this and how can security actually, again, be leveraged to do things faster, of higher quality. The other piece is embracing automation and monitoring. So that's a big piece of DevSecOps. So that's going to happen. There's going to be an increase in automation and everything and monitoring with the adoption of DevSecOps. So there's a huge benefit there in a lot of different ways, even outside of DevSecOps. But with DevSecOps, what that does is because there's a greater emphasis on it, other things happen. And we see this all the time working with customers. A lot of it comes down to with automation, for instance, people aren't doing things by hand or with individual scripts, so these things start to become done in a standard way, and things begin to get tracked, and that's from the standpoint of like for instance building environments and provisioning them down to the point provisioning, configuring, and doing whatever to the point that they're torn down. We've worked with a customer to do a migration. There were applications and things that they had thought that had been retired years ago. Come to find out, there were databases and some other things still running in their environment, servers and other things, even though it had been quite some time. So those servers really were kind of forgotten about, and those servers represented a risk. Not only that, when we think about this in monitoring and automation, let's think about auditing and compliance, whether that's CIS scans or STIG, whether that's just internal benchmarks that everyone at your company may have. It could also be that you've got to do industry regulations and things there as well. So again, kind of different levels of auditing in compliance. Now, the other piece here is standardizing on a process and tooling. Now, there's always some debate around this, and it's always a very constructive conversation to have and to go through, and it's necessary because it can be challenging with different groups. Let's say lots of different dev groups, things like that. They may have invested time into different platforms and everything, but we've got to think about is, it's those individual teams did what works best for them individually. But when you've got all these different tools and platforms and things like that, that means that if you want to start to implement security, well, how do you make sure that security is being done each way in all these different tools? So it actually makes it even harder now, as opposed to if you start to consolidate on one platform, now everybody, you start to have these standardized processes in terms of what's the build and release process, what's being done from scanning and everything there. So again, thinking about security, you get a level of consistency to make sure it's always being applied. Quite honestly, too, it makes it easier for these teams. Yes, they've taken the time, they've learned whatever the tools and platforms are, but in our experience, you know, a lot of the same platforms, CI/CD platforms, they all really do the same thing. It's just, you do it a little bit different. So it's actually easy for teams to learn, and they're going to get a much greater benefit. And again, there's that security aspect to it. Um, and again, also making sure that security gaps are filled and addressed, because if every team has things done different ways, then there's no standardization, there's no guarantee that security things are in place. Um, and again, this is, that process of standardizing on tools and things like that. Usually, there's quite a bit of discussion there, and good discussion. It's just about really trying to coalesce and get everybody on the same page to make sure that things are done in a consistent manner. Not only that, but also when we think about the processes, and making sure that processes are, the same in terms of the build and release and what else is done. Because when it's done that way, now going back to measuring, is that, different groups are going to onboard potentially at a different rate, and that's okay. And so you want to really kind of have a standard way to measure across a lot of different dimensions. And you'll hear that in part 3 in greater detail, but it allows you to do that now when you have some standards and things like that. And this just goes back to, again, when we think about security and the cost, now this goes down to per issue. You can see there roughly $60 billion annually. That was from National Institutes there, from one of their testing guides. But as you go up through different, different environments, right, it takes more time, and therefore the cost goes up. So the longer something sits, in other words, something was around all the way out into production, right? The longer it lived, the more expensive it's going to get, and the greater the impact it has. And so that's really, really important to really think about, and why it's so important too, to really start to, again, continue to shift left and move security, because from the numbers we went over before, and you can see these numbers, we don't want to have these breaches. We want to, if something's going to happen, we want to be able to identify it very, very quickly. And also, again, the cost per issue that's found, we want to keep very, very low. And this all goes back to increasing quality, increasing security, and being able to do this at scale and at speed. And really, what are we trying to get to? So we really want to change how we do DevOps, right? We as you see here, we say DevOps versus DevSecOps. It's not really as though one versus the other. Really, DevSecOps is the next iteration. It's the maturation, the next version of DevOps, and it really has a focus on security, right? It's in the name, and it's really about making it a first-class citizen. And really what we want to do is go from having sequential DevSecOps, which has, really localized, maybe optimized DevOps team, but really they start to kind of operate is together on their own, but yet dev is and ops is still kind of separated. We've seen this a number of times. And so you still have some silos, and there's still a little bit of friction when it comes to, handoff. And then, we've seen things where like the DevOps team controls all the things being built and a lot of other things. And so there's kind of all these things around waiting for permission. And then sometimes, and we always want to avoid this, finger pointing, that doesn't get anywhere. And then again, still, you get security as an afterthought, and then there's going to still obviously be some guesswork and unpredictability. What we really want to do is move into a faster DevOps lifecycle where it's very much visible and it's efficient and it's governed. That's the security piece and the audit and compliance piece, where all these groups, again, are working together in a seamless fashion. Everybody's empowered to act because, again, everybody's thinking about security. And really, because everybody's thinking about security, there's full accountability when it comes to security as well. And about, again, when something happens and is identified, how do you learn from it? And now, again, that security is embedded really in the SDLC as opposed to an afterthought. And really, what else does this come down to? This is about being measured and known. So having an idea of where things are at. You might have vulnerabilities that aren't going to be addressed, and that's okay, but at least knowing about them. So as we start to wrap up, this is one of my favorite things because it came from the FTC. It's a really, great guide that really can't recommend enough. But one of the things that came from it is it says that companies that consider security from the start assess their options and make reasonable choice based on the nature of their business and sensitivity of the information involved. Threats to data may transform over time, but the fundamentals of sound security remain constant. What really stuck out for me and in my experience and what we do here is at Accelino working with customers is it is about the fundamentals and the best practices. It's not about necessarily just picking the tools, right? Those tools and platforms, they're just tools and platforms. They may change over time. But if we really work, again, if we outline those fundamentals and then therefore everything from that standpoint adheres to those fundamentals, and again, security from the start, that is going to be the best foot forward, and that is going to allow an organization to learn and make changes as needed. And as you can see here again, you look at options and you make reasonable choices based on kind of the business and the sensitivity of those decisions. And again, what that is also about to say is, yes, there are ways to do DevSecOps. There's going to be similarities between companies, but there's also going to be differences. It is not necessarily one size fits all. And again, we'll talk about that in the next webinar. So I want to say thank you. Again, you can find us here, as you can see, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, social media, and everything. But really, again, want to say thank you for attending. And if you're starting your DevSecOps or your DevOps journey and you're looking to really have someone help you either build a strategy or help you implement your strategy, our experts are there to do that. We know what this is like. We do this day and I can't tell you how passionate we are about it because a lot of our folks, if not all of our folks, have really lived through what it was like before all of this. And so we understand the benefits and everything. So if you'd like help, you can reach out to us at hello@accelino.io. So AXCELINNO.io. You can go to our website or feel free to reach out on our social platforms like LinkedIn and Twitter. So I just want to say thank you for joining part 2 of our 3-part DevSecOps webinar series. If you haven't already listened to part 1, which is what is DevSecOps, it is available on our YouTube channel and on our website. And again, if you aren't already following us on LinkedIn or Twitter, definitely feel free to go ahead to follow us so you can then get information about part 3 and then any other information that we continue to have available for really your understanding is there's a lot of different topics here. So I hope you enjoyed and we will see you next time. Thank you so much.